I Just Want to Be Loved is the latest book from Casey Watson. This was released, I think, on the 14th of April, so 3 days ago. Obviously, I bought it straight away. I'm now at that really painful stage with Casey Watson, as I have been for a couple of years now, where I've read everything she's written and I have that agonising wait for the next book to be released. So I jumped on this the day it was released, of course, and I have to say, it's well written, mostly. I will discuss what I mean by that. But for me, this is not one of the most exciting, and you kind of can't blame the narrative for that because it's based on truth. But at the same time, there are creative liberties taken with all of these books by foster carers, partly because they need to hide the identity of the individual. So, in this case, Casey is looking after a teenage girl called Elise. She's 14 years old. She's basically off the rails, but she's not that severe. She doesn't smoke, she doesn't drink, she's not doing drugs. She has some questionable friends, but she's not really hanging out with a bad crowd. She's just got a bit of a strange personality where she's really sweet at home, but then she goes out with friends and then comes home and makes lies up about them and causes problems. So she is not actually that problematic, which means that the narrative itself is not that interesting because it's not that dramatic. And I feel like since they're taking creative license to change some of the facts, obviously her name's not Elise in real life, they change other things about it. I'm not sure exactly how much. I think it differs depending on the writer or indeed the publishers, how much they change. But I feel like they could have added in a few things to make it a bit more interesting without lying about it. Maybe focus on some more of the dramatic lies that she told rather than just glossing over them. So the actual narrative itself wasn't that gripping until about halfway. In fact, I think it was 60 something percent on the Kindle. I had read the ebook version. I think it was about 60 something percent when it started to get quite interesting, and that's the point at which Elise begins to open up and talk about her past. Because she is acting out because she has had a pretty traumatic past. But at the same time, even her past isn't that traumatic. If you're new to books written by foster carers, then maybe you'll think it's quite gripping because it is quite shocking what happened to her. But when you compare it to a lot of other books, it's kind of not very interesting because it only happened for a short period of time. We don't really get that much information about what happened to her. Not that I'm asking for nitty gritty gory details, but it's kind of like because Casey wasn't really learning too much about what had happened, and indeed she refused to actually read the report from the therapist because she wasn't kind of prepared for that, which is completely understandable. It meant that we as readers were not opened up to a lot of the intricacies of the trauma from her past. So it kind of wasn't very interesting because we didn't really learn that much. As I said, if you're new to these kind of books, you might find it quite compelling because it is shocking. But when you've read everything else that Casey Watson has written, and there are some really harrowing tales with a lot of really quite damaging stories that are being shared with a lot of detail, this just pales in comparison. Not that I'm saying I wish Elise had a more troubling past. Of course not. But I guess the point I'm trying to make is that this story in itself is not that complex. It's not that fascinating. So, in a way, it's not the narrative's fault because it's based on truth, but maybe they could have changed the focus a little bit or shared a few more details that they could have maybe changed up slightly to hide Elise's true identity, of course. Because we all know these books are very heavily based on true stories, but we all know that creative liberties are taken both to make them a bit more interesting and also, of course, to hide the true identity, which is the main focus. I enjoyed it enough. It's relatively well written, and the reason I say relatively well written is because, and I've mentioned this before when I've talked about Casey Watson's books, every one of her sentences comprises like 3 or 4 clauses. I'm slightly exaggerating, but I wish her publisher or her editor would just say, rein back on the commas. Maybe make your sentences a little less complex because they're very there are just too many clauses. It makes it very clunky to read. It's very unnatural. It makes them overly complicated. And I guess long-winded and waffly is the ineloquent way to put that. But that's a problem I've had with her editor for quite a while, or basically for the entirety of reading her work, for as long as I can remember at least. She needs a better editor. It's as simple as that. I don't blame her for it because she's not a writer by trade. I think she's a brilliant storyteller, but her editor needs to learn to do a bit more editing. It's a relatively enjoyable book. I read it in a couple of sittings. It's not as gripping as pretty much everything else she's written. Elise as a character is too likable. She's too easy to get on with. It's not that compelling. It's not that dramatic. There are, potential threats of things that could happen and could make it quite interesting. And then they end up coming to nothing. It was okay. It wasn't brilliant. If this was the first of Casey Watson's books I read, it wouldn't have really put me in a good mood for the rest of her books, but I will say it's quite anomalous in the sense that, although it's written in her usual style, and I really enjoyed Casey as a character, of course, as a narrator, she's a character in her own right, and I still like her as a writer and as a character. I just think this narrative was not that interesting, not that very well told, and ultimately just a bit of a weak link. Of course, I don't mind having bought it and read it. Looking forward very much so to Casey Watson's next book. I just think Elise's story, maybe on the bright side, was not as dramatic, or compelling as it could have been.